there's an expression that you may have found yourselves yelling at a spouse, maybe, or kids or grandkids when they come visiting and come into the warm house on a cold night and leave the door partly open. Have you heard this one? You might yell out, "Close the door, where were you born, in a barn?" Have you heard that one, or is that like a regional thing? I grew up hearing that in New England. "Where were you born, a barn?" Well, one year, one of my irreverent clergy friends, or it actually could have been my mom, sent me a Christmas card with this scene on it. Imagine, if you will. Jesus, grown-up Jesus, wearing a red robe, standing in the foyer of a dwelling place, with his hands clasped patiently and pious before him, like this, just standing and looking sweet and lovely. And he's just entered, so behind him the door is still somewhat open, and there's just gusts of snow, swirls of snow entering the home. In the foreground of this image, you see a close-up of Mother Mary, who's holding her blue headscarf close under her chin with one hand, and she is angrily exclaiming, "Jesus, close the door! Where were you born, in a barn?" And of course, the joke is that yes, he was born in a barn. So it comes down to us over thousands of years that this man of peace, this healer, this lover of humanity, was born in a manger among animals, in the straw, in the dust, in the dirt. The traditional carols that we sing this time of year tend to focus on the divinity of the situation, how full of holiness Jesus was, the meeting of heaven and earth that arrived with his birth. There is a lot of fancy theology in these carols, much fancier, in fact, than many of us who love and admire Jesus and try to walk the path he taught can really relate to. King of angels, heaven's all-gracious King. That doesn't really square with our tradition, which focuses on the itinerant rabbi Jesus with his dirty feet that was washed by adoring disciples whose feet he in turn washed to show that he was their friend. The Jesus who, in one story, spit into his hands and put them on a blind man's eyes, bringing about a healing. That very earthy Jesus, wearing simple garments, no gold, nothing fancy. A human child, a holy person, born, though, on a bed of straw with sheep milling about, born into dangerous and violent times like our own. A child whose life was worth nothing in the empire into which he was born. A child who was precious to his parents and who eventually became precious to a significant portion of humankind. He was born in a barn. That wasn't a mistake or an embarrassing fact that Jesus needed to overcome. That birth, the location of that birth, is central to the story, central to the understanding of what God, what the Holy is doing in this moment, the message of God to humanity in this moment. You know, in our striving culture, we're so accustomed to that hero's narrative of rising from our humble beginnings, right? People say, I was born in a barn, or I was born on the side of the highway. I came from nothing. I was born to poor immigrant parents, and I overcame the poverty and the squalor of my origins. And then they show you the big house, you know, and you get the helicopter view. And we applaud and admire that person. And yet, who is more admirable than Jesus of Nazareth? The one of whom we sing in our carols that he is a savior. What does that mean? For me, it means that Jesus saves us from our mistaken idea that transcendence means to overcome and leave behind the humble, to overcome and leave behind the places that are real, that are gritty, that are dirty, where struggling and suffering happens. He was born in a barn where it is stinky and messy and humble. And he never seeks to overcome that humble beginning. In fact, the entire life and ministry of the man whom sacred legend tells us was born this night in Bethlehem was focused on abiding in those messy, real, dirty, painful places as a lover and healer and friend both of those places and those who live in those places. He did not seek to overcome his humble beginning, but to enter fully into the reality of it. He spent his life preaching the inviolable dignity of those who live in those places, of all who live in that space, in that real, earthy reality. All his entire ministry, all the teachings we remember and revere him for, all his wisdom, all his healing, his encouragement of the poor and oppressed, his solidarity with them, happened almost without exception in places, in locations that were no more glamorous than the manger he was born in. In the midst of our striving, competitive lives, may we receive as a gift tonight the story of God's love being born into this world just as it is, broken, messy, violent, animal, real. What will you do with this gift? What will you do knowing that God comes to us born again and again, not after we're made perfect, not after we're all cleaned up and shiny and living in big, beautiful mansions, but as we are, where we are in this condition? What will you do to make room in your heart as the animals made room for that mother laboring in pain on the straw, made room for that newborn baby who cried in relief and wonder, the wonder of being alive? Love and joy and God's blessing do not come to us when we transcend or rise above the blood and guts reality of our human predicament, but come as we are, where we are, and dwells with us there. That is what Emmanuel means. It means God with us. So, friends, please take with you this year, this difficult year, this evening. Please take with you this simple truth, that the sacred story given all of us, handed down to us over these many generations, is not a rags to riches story. It is quite the opposite. It is a rags to love story. Jesus very intentionally never rose above his humble birth in a barn. The whole point was that he had no need to. Love was born this night in a barn. When you are struggling and striving, remember that. Remember where love was born and is born, and where it abides. Only in reality. Only when we enter fully into the reality together where honesty and truth can be found. Remember that child born in a barn, in dangerous and violent times like our own, who lived not to make a success of himself in our sense of that word, but to give of him whole self to the coming of God's realm of justice and radical hospitality and love.